active duty Marine JAG officer with 4 deployments to Iraq. Now he's running for Congress in one of the bluest states in the country, in Maryland. Join me today on the David Rutherford Show. Mr. Burnett, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could carve out a little time in your race to the finish of campaigning to join me today. So welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, and I welcome the break from the primary sprint.
I bet, man. We've had a few former operators and military personnel vets on that have been running, and just the magnitude of what it means to run even at a state level, but at a federal level is just pretty substantial. Could you give us a little bit background on currently what your campaign looks like, what your day-to-day looks like, and just how much time the investment is in order to really get out there and try and convince the people of your district you're the man for the job?
And for a little bit of context, I retired last February after 22 years on active duty. So when I made the decision to run, which in part was born out of necessity, my wife wanted to stay in Maryland. My kids wanted to finish the schools they were in. The decision was made last summer to run, and it has been a steady increase in terms of volume of work and just the number of commitments. And it's been a great learning process for me. Coming off active duty, and as you know, you really only have one speed, and you're accustomed to just putting your head down and grinding forward. What I'm finding out is this is a very different environment. I'm working a lot of with volunteers. I'm working with folks that are political activists, and it's a very different environment. I'm very much accustomed to everybody is mission-centric and everybody sprints, and this has been a very different experience to sort of bring along sort of this coalition of the willing, if you will. And it's been a challenge. But now that we're in the sprint to the primary, it's very much at least 2 to 3 hours of calls per day, trying to engage supporters and donors, looking at constantly setting up events, some cases events to just bring in and get your message out, and then other events that are designed entirely for fundraising. But there's really no let up. And that's what's also interesting is there's not a start or a stop. So I find myself sending text messages before I go to the gym at 5 a.m, and I find myself fielding calls at midnight because that's when somebody's available. So it's a challenge. It feels a little different, but I wish there were more veterans running for office because, quite frankly, we're built for this. We're built for the grind. We're built for thankless work. And essentially, our mindset is to serve others. How do you set the conditions for other people to succeed? And that's essentially what this is.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. That's why we try and really focus on finding veterans that have decided to jump into this political arena or battlefield, which in my opinion is 1,000 times more difficult than the regular battlefield, if you will, because it's pretty black and white there. And, politics is just a whole myriad of different grays, right? One of the interesting things I remember, I actually thought about running for, and I live in a pretty blue county down in Southeast Florida, and in the congressional district I was considering to run for back in 22. It was predominantly Democrat, and if it was traditionally it had always gone Democrat, and they said, as I was exploring it mostly from the financial perspective, one of the things I found out that it was about a $3 to $5 million district, just your basic introductory race, with your primary and then the main race. And then if it was contested and the Democrats really wanted to go for broke on it, it could flex to $20 million. Can you describe what your district is? And correct me if I'm wrong, but like Camp David's where you're at, and I'm wearing my Camp David shirt in your honor and all that, but give us a spectrum of what type of fundraising is a component of the district you're running for.
A little bit of context as well. So I'm in Western Maryland. Congressional District 6 starts in Montgomery County, which is one of the bluest counties in the country and one of the wealthier counties in the country. I live in a town called Gaithersburg, which is at the very bottom of Congressional District 6. The district itself extends all the way up through Frederick County, Washington County, and then out along the Panhandle. And the district changes dramatically from plus 25 blue in Montgomery County to plus 25 and above out in Garrett, Allegheny, and Washington counties. So with that dynamic, you have a very interesting tension between the wealthy sort of ultra-left Montgomery County and then the rest of the district, which is very much red, tried and true Republican, about as conservative as you can get. So there's tension within the district. But as you probably, if you don't have to look far to realize that two of the wealthiest people to have ever served in Congress are currently competing in a primary between the incumbent, April McLean Delaney, who is arguably worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she's running against David Trone, who was the former Congressional District 6 representative, until he had spent $60 million losing a primary to Also Brooks when he ran for the Senate in 24.
Wow.
So I'm running against two of the wealthiest people to have ever served in Congress ever. And they're in a brutal primary right now, which we're welcoming because the argument goes is we're not going to even try to go dollar for dollar. He spent $60 million losing a primary in the Senate race. The thought is on ego alone, he's going to spend $30, $40, $50 million. Our approach is going to be to turn his or hers strength into a weakness. They're going to be extremely overexposed. They're racing to the far left. You can't turn around without seeing a TV commercial, a digital ad, or something on Facebook or any other social media site. And they're sprinting to the left because they're both trying to secure the upper Montgomery ultra-left vote. That's not going to resonate across the district, and you can't win this district without performing in Frederick and at least performing across the Panhandle. So we see this year as our greatest opportunity to finally flip Maryland 6th, because it not only is going to result in a bruising primary on the Democrat side, whoever emerges, they're going to be very much far left and bruised, overexposed. And then what you're going to have on our side is I'm entering this with an economic development argument, running on a military record, and very much representing the conservative values that have been ignored across the Panhandle. So it's an uphill battle. We're thinking that we're going to have to raise between 1.5 and 3 million to their arguably 10, 20, 30 million plus, knowing that we're going to try to make data-informed decisions, and we're going to run a very much a grassroots campaign, trying to meet people where they are and actually solving problems and not just speaking to platitudes.
That's a great explanation of what the current spend looks like. When I went back and I looked at the political history of the district, I went, all the way back to 2006 with Roscoe Bartlett, who looked like he had that district pretty well wrapped up for years and years and years before then he lost over to John Delaney. Can you describe how that shift happened? Because I do realize that district used to just be hardcore blue for years and years. What took place to where it became a more contested district? So
you're 100% right that this was as red as you could get district. Roscoe Bartlett was going on his 18th year, 9th term, when it had been gerrymandered to now include the upper Montgomery portion. And so after 9 terms in Congress, a beloved congressman, Roscoe Bartlett, was essentially gerrymandered out by April McLean Delaney's husband, John Delaney. And so we've had a series of out-of-district millionaires running CD6 from out-of-district since 2012.
Wow.
And I've described it as they've been playing national politics at the expense of a majority of the district since 2012. Just another tidbit in there, Dan Bongino ran for CD6 in 2014. In my very first campaign event, I did it with Roscoe Bartlett, who, by the way, is 100 years old.
Oh, wow.
And the funny thing about that, I couldn't get a word in edgewise on stage with him. He's as sharp as ever. He was talking about electromagnetic pulse attacks and living off the grid in West Virginia. He's a great guy. I mean, I enjoyed everything we talked about, from West Virginia to the electromagnetic pulse attacks that, if you're familiar, and I'm sure you are, Fort Meade, we're in the process of moving some things around to make it less susceptible to being close to a highway. I mean, there's some obvious concerns we had that he had raised that there's some adjustments being made. But it was just interesting to hear this 100-year-old, very accomplished individual talk about everything from his time in Congress to being gerrymandered out to living off the grid in West Virginia. So it's very much a district that has been in flux. What I mean by that is they gerrymandered the Republicans out, and we've been gaining ground ever since. And what we think this particular year where we have an opportunity, the fastest growing affiliation in Congressional District 6 is unaffiliated. Mm-hmm. So I have to get through a closed primary, which I have the lead on. I should get through the primary, and we should go into the general election very strong. But we've already tailored a message that's designed to address our base, but more importantly, to be very receptive to an unaffiliated voter or even a centrist Democrat. And that's the innovation corridor, which I hope we'll talk about later, but really looking at economic development across the district as opposed to just your normal talking points of Democrat, platitudes and Republican platitudes. We're actually presenting a plan that should benefit everybody in the district for some overdue economic development that focuses on infrastructure, energy production, and most importantly, job creation.
I think that's always for me the big thing about Maryland, right? I think a lot of times y'all get lost in the shadow of DC politics, obviously. But Maryland is such a remarkable state in many different ways, and it's pretty diverse economically. But it has struggled, right? I mean, there is a current $1.5 billion deficit going on right now. Obviously, the city centers of Baltimore have just been decimated. I remember, that best friend I told you about who lived out in your district for a while. He grew up in Baltimore, family of 4 siblings, 2 parents. Dad worked, for Johnson & Johnson. Mom worked at Baltimore County Hospital, and they could survive on those small salaries. But you look at and also Baltimore was just this thriving area. It's one of my favorite places to go on weekends when we'd leave Penn State and go down and have Maryland crabs down in Baltimore on the, but that place doesn't seem to exist anymore. And, as you look at some of the challenges, there were 25,000 federal job losses in 2025, right? You did have some education, health services growth and leisure hospitality, but professional business services were down 477,000 jobs. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the need to really get focused on economic development, innovation growth? I hear you talk a lot about data center development, but not in traditional farmland area, in industrialized areas. Can you just talk about what your understanding of current Maryland economic policy is, and then what you think you'll be able to bring forward if you should win the general election?
There's a lot to unpack there. I'll start with the economic mismanagement of the state. There's been a Democrat supermajority for as long as anyone can remember, and there's been a complete mismanagement of spending. There's not a revenue problem. Maryland is one of the wealthier states in the country. There's really a spending problem. There's zero accountability. But one of the other problems is that Maryland has put all of its eggs in essentially one basket, and that was federal employees, contractors, and state employees. That is not a diversified income, diversified sources of income. And what happened is then with DOGE coming in and doing what was overdue, they paid a heavy price here in Maryland because they had become so dependent on all that extra federal employment support, whether it was employees or contractors. There was a significant hit in Maryland. And I think a lot of people realize that, wow, we've been on this gravy train for a really long time, and we cannot rely on federal employment, state jobs, and contracting positions to sustain our economy. But what's happened also is that you hear people talk about Maryland wanting to be the California of the East. So we've had a series of policies and laws that were passed that make it almost impossible to run a business. You have entire industries that were run out of business, whether it was coal, timber, or dairy farming. These things don't exist in Maryland anymore, and they were staple industries for decades. And then you start to look around and you realize something is like a small business. The last decision that my wife had to make in terms of supporting my run for Congress was when she was not able to start a business. And we talked, briefly off air for a moment. She was not excited about me running for Congress. I'll say the least. Over the course of 22 years, I had deployed 5 times, 4 on the ground in Iraq, once on a MEU. And the MEU workup is probably harder than the actual MEU deployment. The deployment is one direction. You go out, you come back. The workup is 6 months of on the ship, off the ship, on the ship, off the ship, some other type of training. So we added it all up. At some point over the course of our marriage, I was gone almost 6.5, 7 years. So
Wow.
Really, she wanted me back in the house with the kids and having a normal life. And that's when I was like, well, what do you think about running for Congress? And she was not excited at all. And then inevitably, she became much more aware of the consequences of a political environment when she decided she wanted to start a business. She wanted to run a laundromat in Montgomery County. And as a naturalized U.S. citizen from West Africa, this was the American dream for her. And I felt like it was my duty to support her interests. She'd been following me around, raising our 4 kids. So we started looking into it together, and we realized it was going to take over a year to get through the licensing, the permits, the inspections, and everything else that's involved. And as a single income military family living in Congressional District 6, this was just not feasible. And whenever you have small businesses that are out of reach, you start to realize there's a fundamental problem with your economy. If all you have is the ability to make high-end earning as a federal or state employee, or you're going to be on the lower end of a service economy that's going to require federal or state assistance, well, that's not sustainable. That's not healthy for the individuals living under that environment, and it's not good for the state itself. So as I started to look into this, and I finally had her blessing to run, I started to ask, what folks were concerned about, basically my neighbors, and it was consistent. Everybody was concerned about infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure, and the congestion that is the greater D.C. area traffic, everything from the American Legion Bridge to 270 to I-70 and I-68. And then, of course, this year in particular was the energy price. Most people's energy bills went up, almost doubled, in some cases tripled. And then at other parts of the district, where there's also been a mismanagement of utilities, you have a water crisis where water bills have skyrocketed across Allegheny and Garrett counties. And then the last part of that was not only do we have a problem with infrastructure and energy and water, we have a real problem with good paying jobs. So we have to bring back advanced manufacturing or bring back something that's going to be good middle income jobs that are going to be here for the foreseeable future. So when I looked at this problem, as anybody in the military would, you look for, okay, how do I solve this? This is a gigantic problem. Any one of these would be difficult. Maybe instead of trying to solve one or the other, we align them. And that was the innovation corridor. It was, okay, how do I take existing resources, existing capabilities, and align that to the interests of the district? And what I found is that we could take federal highway funds to build the infrastructure that's needed to support growth. And now this would not only be the federal highway network that's in place, this would be refurbishing the American Legion Bridge, expanding I-270 all the way up to Frederick, looking at the I-70 interchange, as well as the I-68 and I-81 corridors. Now, once you have that federal money in place, that can serve as a carrot and a stick for counties to get in line with appropriate zoning that will align with or protect local residents. What we've seen over the recent last couple of months, in particular, and over the last several years, counties were quick to accommodate data centers at the expense of local residents because they saw dollar signs, they saw the property tax benefit. So I wanted to make sure we would use existing federal funds to support national security priorities along our federal highway network to build an infrastructure that would support development. Then what you've done with that carrot and the stick, which could be anywhere from $8 to $12 billion of federal money, you get state and county alignment so that now if a data center is going to arrive, it goes where we designate it. And this would be in what I've just described as an opportunity zone. This would be existing industrial or commercial spaces. These would be away from residential areas, certainly away from schools or anywhere else that would not be impacted by the existence of a data center and some of the things that are associated with it. Now, the other problem with the data center and the economic development plan is the data centers are arriving right now, and they're almost unregulated, and you have the state and counties bending to the will of a data center. And you don't have to look past Adamstown in Frederick County, where They're building this plane in flight. They didn't have to do this. If they had just done a little bit of planning, they would have realized that 500 diesel generators running intermittently as emergency power is not a good thing. It's definitely not a good thing to have within a half a mile of a school. Mm-hmm. Data center developer's solution was not to look at small modular reactors as I've been proposing. Their solution was, we'll put air monitors in your child's classroom. Yeah. Could you imagine a concerned mom being told, don't worry, we'll let you know when the air is bad because we'll have a monitor in your child's classroom.
And it cracks me up too, because these are the Green New Deal freaks too. You know what I mean? Exactly. These are the people. It's the hypocrisy. It knows no bounds, right? It's
now running as the Republican. I'm the one talking about, not that it's that odd, but I'm the one saying highest environmental, health, and safety standards. I'm the one saying we need to look at energy sources other than diesel generators. I'm saying small modular reactors. You know, this idea of what we've been using on aircraft carriers and submarines for decades has been commercialized. And you probably saw the article. They took one from a factory floor, put it into, I think, a C-5, flew it to a military base and flipped it on. I mean, you want to talk about an extraordinary capability that's just waiting to solve our energy crisis. That's it. And we have a developer here in Rockville, Maryland, that we have the ability locally to support some of our energy needs. So back to the innovation corridor is looking at aligning those federal highway funds to get counties and state in line. You would welcome a data center if that's what the local residents want, knowing that it's going to be in an area that's not going to compromise farmland or residential areas. You require them to have a small modular reactor and a water treatment plant. And then what you'd also co-locate with the data center is AI and quantum research, as well as advanced manufacturing. And I know I don't have to tell you this, but the 2026 National Security Strategy listed all of them as national security priorities. So when people come back to me and say, well, Chris, this is a pretty big proposal, I'm like, well, if you want to get things done, you align it to national security priorities. Suddenly, federal money will find its way to support our effort to focus on AI and quantum development, advanced manufacturing, whether it's steel or semiconductors, all aligned to data centers, which also represent a critical vulnerability when you're talking about our national security interests. So you look at the infrastructure piece, you look at the data center development, energy, water, and then the jobs would be the advanced manufacturing part. And having that energy intensive advanced manufacturing, that's where you get the sustainable jobs outside of the construction phase of a data center, and then the somewhat empty data center in an area that's already designated as an opportunity zone away from residential areas and away from schools. So that was it in a nutshell as to how to address what had been this supermajority mismanagement of Maryland, particularly the indifference towards Western Maryland, where we've had these out-of-district millionaires playing national politics at the expense of locals. And I've even gone so far as to describe Trone and Delaney as sort of the let them eat cake mentality. Like they will sprinkle a little bit of federal money on the district and say that they've done something for the locals. Well, that's pennies on the dollar of what these people need. And more importantly, what people need is the dignity of work. They want to have the ability to provide for their families with a job or some opportunity associated with development, not a federal handout or a state program.
I just want to really talk about my incredible partnership with one of my best friends, and that's Evan Hafer and the boys over at Black Rifle Coffee. I'm so honored to be a part of their organization. And just really can't thank them enough for allowing me to participate. What I want you to do is go to blackriflecoffee.com, and I want to check out their new energy drinks. They have these incredible energy drinks that you can buy at all different kinds of stores, Walmart, Bass Sports, and others. Or you can go online and order. And if you want to put in your little promo code FrogLogic20, there you get a little discount on stuff there. I highly recommend that. For me, it's my morning coffee. I am addicted to Black Rifle Coffee's Just Black. I think the Tiger Stripe camo definitely reels me in. The other one I love is the AK Espresso. This one right here is phenomenal. Love these, but they have so many different things that you could get at Black Rifle Coffee. You will love it. Again, when you go over blackriflecoffee.com and you're checking out, type in FrogLogic20, get your little discount code, and tell them, oh, Rut sent you. So to all those folks out there who love coffee like I do, please do yourself a favor and go over and check out my brothers at BRCC. Oh, and we've got a cool event coming up that I'm going to be a part of out in Vegas. It's a staccato big shooting event with BRCC on April 15th. So Jordy and I are going to go out and participate in that. We'll get some good footage and maybe a couple interviews. All right. Hoo-yah. Well, I think you're spot on. And when you have politicians that are playing that type of game, right, only to benefit themselves or whoever their lobby firms are that are backing them, I think, you have this, this collapse of hope within your workforce, right? Your labor force, which I think a great portion of obviously Eastern Maryland has experienced at a high degree. But like these innovation stretches that you're talking about could create that whole new type of reindustrialization. We've had several economists on the show who've talked about Trump's, plan to reindustrialize America. And I think a primary source of that will be in and around the defense industry, right? He's going to kind of break the lock of the top five and spread it out across some more innovative firms out there that are doing really unique things, like the portable energy systems, nuclear energy systems. One of my best friends, Sean Ryan, and he had one of the top guys who's doing those modular reactors on a commercial level. And the technology's there. It's just this bizarre, I don't know. It's like you said, let them eat cake kind of mentality.
It is.
One of the things that obviously you're dealing with is you're dealing with a substantial changing electorate. And you referenced it early in the conversation about you kind of have to go after this independent base. And that was really, I think, the in large part, the crew that really brought in Trump and helped him win the popular vote in the Electoral College this time. That also seems to be a little upset with some of the promises he made on the campaign trail. But it seems like your message is really targeting the things that they're interested in, right? When you talk about the moms who want control of their own curriculum at schools and who, want their kind of the MAHA movement that's out there. You also have, people that want to be able to give more economic opportunity to young people, the Generation Z, the Zoomers, they're being called now, which is actually, in fact, a larger voting bloc than the Boomers, who are, the traditional hardcore Republican voters. What is the message that you can give those kind of independent younger voters, right? The people that are in their early 30s who had just had their first kid, who maybe are looking at some of the industry that they've been employed in, kind of moving away from AI and potential, some of the other sectors that seem to be maybe on the brink of being exterminated, if you will. What is the message? What is the clear message you're going to tell them right now? How are you going to get them out of their homes, out of their apartments, right, their rentals, in order to vote for you to gain economic prosperity?
Well, first and foremost, we can only address the affordability crisis that was really brought on by Democrat mismanagement with opportunity. And this isn't going to happen on its own. We have to dismantle some of the regulatory structure that was put in place by Democrats. So we've got to get people engaged and excited.
Chris, can I hop in real quick? I'm sorry. I brought this up after I saw, the piece about your wife. I just brought up. So in Maryland, for cleaning, dyeing, processing laundry, there's a trader's license. There's a zoning and land use approval. building, electrical, plumbing, and occupancy permits, water and sewer approvals, fire department clearance inspection, health and environmental improvements, local business licenses and permits in some jurisdictions. And then you have signage, vending, annual personal property return, employees, unemployment insurance. Like, it was, I could not believe how extensive that was to start a real, what's been considered by, legal and illegal immigrants for the history of our country as one of those primary businesses for entry to be able to feed your family and make a living.
And that's a perfect segue, because that was the final straw for my wife. The American dream for her was to start a business. I've been moving her all around the country. I've been gone all this time. The thought was, okay, we're close. I grew up in Pittsburgh. Her family lives in New Carrollton. This was a good place for us to stay, let our kids enjoy being in one place for a while. And coming off my last deployment, I was actually bouncing between Baghdad and Kuwait, my last deployment. So I had orders to the Pentagon. That's how we landed in Gaithersburg. Mm-hmm. And we realized as we started to kind of sink our roots in here and make this our home, it was going to be almost impossible to live that American dream for her. And we're a single income military family. I've got 4 school-age kids. It was going to be impossible. So whenever you start looking at people like my family, you're just struggling in a state that has what should be enormous upside. There's this incredibly well-educated population. There's a tremendous federal highway network. You have access to D.C. You have access to Baltimore, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and throughout the eastern seaboard. And yet there's almost no opportunity because of this hyper-regulation and this sort of heavily bureaucratic state that wants to over-regulate to the point of control, but really creating dependency versus opportunity. And so when I talk to young people, what they really want is less government, but they want problems to be solved. And that's where I see my role. As a congressman, I can't solve every problem, but I can leverage federal money to serve as a carrot and a stick to try to get the state of Maryland and some of the counties in CD6 to align with opportunity, to look at their environmental regulations, to look at their licensing and their permitting and saying, if you can just get out of the way, Maryland, or one of the counties here in Western Maryland, I'd say we can bring in the opportunity that your residents are needing. This will give them the opportunity to have the job that will provide for their families, and then potentially allow their children to go away to school or to get vocational training and have a job and stay local. What I've heard from a lot of young people is they've delayed getting married. They've delayed having children because they just can't afford it. And then when I talk to people that are in their 50s and 60s, they say that all of their children had to move away because they just couldn't afford to stay here. And the only way to address that is opportunity. And the way you create opportunity is you look at taking existing federal money, no new taxes, no new fees. You take existing federal money, federal highway funds, and the CHIPS Act and the Innovation and Jobs Act. You align it to national security priorities. You build the infrastructure that will set the conditions for private sector investment of data centers, AI, and quantum computing. And then you also require advanced manufacturing. And with the small modular reactor and the water treatment plant, you have now transformed the economy around very real, tangible opportunity. And this is sustainable. Even if in 10 years data centers become obsolete, well, the energy production and the water treatment will be aligned to the AI and quantum computing research and development, as well as the advanced manufacturing. So we've got a baked-in plan to deal with the possibility of a data center becoming obsolete or moving on to whatever's next. It's the advanced manufacturing. And the most important part is designating the opportunity zone in existing industrial commercial sites, not compromising an inch of farmland so that we can build a giant steel building and really, quite frankly, ruin what makes Western Maryland so beautiful, which is farmland and open spaces. I've seen, and I'm sure you've read about, the eminent domain power lines that are cutting across Western Maryland, destroying farmland to deliver power to the data centers in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is insane.
Eminent domain in and of itself is one of the most, I understand the necessity of it for obvious reasons, but what's going on now just seems to be one more in a long line of just like, are you kidding me? Like why does Western Maryland farmland have to take the hit for Virginia's inability to they've got plenty of farmland, right? Make them do it.
That's the problem I have. Eminent domain for public good. It could be a large infrastructure project. It could be serving a greater good. This is eminent domain for mismanagement. This is poor planning. So this is incompetence now taking property, private property, from owners. In some cases, generations of farmers being told, hey, we need this because, quite frankly, we're terrible at our jobs. We couldn't think 2 steps ahead, so we're going to take your land and we're going to impose upon you a burden that you're not going to receive the benefit of. And, oh, by the way, it might actually drive your electric bill up because we're offsetting the cost of infrastructure through residential usage.
That's right.
I mean, you talk about incompetence, and this is the Democrat supermajority in Maryland.
Well, I think, I mean, obviously, I think the American population, right or left right now, is a little bit fatigued with the incompetence that we're seeing across the board, right? One of the great things that I always talk about, and I've had, some friends decide to take the leap and go up and participate up in Congress at a federal level. Obviously you're going to get up and you're going to be forced to play that DC game. What are some of the things that you're promising, your constituency that you're going to be resolute on as you get to DC when you win this thing?
Well, first, I've already signed the term limits pledge. I will never stay in Congress beyond, if I'm lucky enough to go once, I'll fight to stay there. I'll never stay more than 5 terms. I think 10 years is already too long.
Right.
Why did they move us around so much in the military? To avoid the stagnation and comfort of being in one place. In the Marine Corps, it's just, if you're not complaining, you're not doing something right.
That's right.
But it kept you sharp, and it kept you, constantly engaged in new ideas and having to address what you were doing and why you're doing it. So first, I won't overstay my welcome. I see this as an extension of my service, and that service is to the people of CD6. This is not for me to have a long-standing career and then to be wheeled in to Congress, as I'm in my 70s or 80s. I mean, the way I see it is you go there, you sprint, and you move on. The other thing I've already said a dozen times, and I'll say it a dozen more, I don't own stock, and I will not trade stock in Congress. How can you possibly make an objective decision when you've got a financial decision, a financial interest in decisions you're making? You don't have to look back. There's a reason why most members of Congress outperform your best investment firms in the country, in some cases by 50 and 100%.
That's right.
And they'll say, well, it's not insider trading because it's public knowledge. Well, it's not public knowledge the moment that they make the decision to buy or sell ahead of a vote that they're about to take. So one, I'm not going to overstay my welcome. I've already signed the term limits pledge. I will not buy, trade, or own stock while I'm in Congress. And then the last part of that, I do not believe in government shutdowns. You exist to serve the interests of the public. If you can't pass a budget that has all of government open, the first people that don't get paid is Congress. And then if it remains closed, they don't leave session. This idea that they get to go back to their district and essentially campaign and talk to their constituents and get paid while a part of our government is shut down is insane. The fact that Department of Homeland Security, as we have active hostilities overseas, if there was ever a time for the Department of Homeland Security to be fully funded and arguably augmented, it's right now. And to hold that department hostage for a Democrat, basically, I've called it a temper tantrum. They don't like what they saw. It has nothing to do with whether it was legal or illegal. They just didn't like something. So they held Department of Homeland Security hostage over an effort to try to adjust policy, not change law, is unacceptable. So to go all the way back to answer your question, how would I address this? Well, by aligning affordability through opportunity with national security, that's what I would hang my hat on. These aren't just pipe dreams. This is not me just telling people what they want to hear. In fact, this is all very much on the cusp of execution. You've got the Trump administration going all in on nuclear. So to leverage the fact that they're trying to get licensing and approval for modular reactors within 12 to 18 months does not mean this is a 5 or a 10-year proposal. The federal highway funds. The question just becomes whether or not we can get it designated for Maryland as opposed to the 30 or 40 or 50 other projects. Well, the way you get it designated and the way you build a coalition in Congress is to align to national security priorities. There's a quid pro quo exchange with the prioritization of national security. So I would go there, not with my hat in hand saying, hey, I made some promises. Can you help me out? This is me saying I'm offering a solution that the private sector wants to pursue in furtherance of our national security priorities by using existing sources of money, CHIPS Act, Innovation and Jobs Act, and federal highway funds. So I would go to Congress steadfast on transparency, accountability, and integrity, and using my approach in the innovation corridor to drive everything that I would do. And then outside of that economic development package, I would default to anything that's going to remove government, anything that's going to lower taxes and ease the burden on your average American citizen. That would be my priority.
That's a good answer. Now let's wrap it up with these kind of two ideas that are, I would imagine, very personal for you, and both of them. First and foremost, I want to talk to you about your feelings on what's going on over in Iran. As a guy that served the entirety of your adult life. I mean, you were in your second year law school during when 9/11 happened, and 22 years active duty. You have committed your life at the highest order. What are your thoughts on where we're at in Iran, and what do you think is the greatest probable, or what would be the greatest outcome for our country?
Well, first and foremost, this is overdue. Across all those deployments, what was always in the background was Iran, whether it was an Iranian proxy, Iranian equipment, Iranian trained groups operating in Iran, Iraq, or elsewhere. Iran has been a pervasive threat to U.S. forces and U.S. interests for my entire adult life. There's an argument that goes back that we should have done this 47 years ago, whenever the Iran hostage crisis. So this was overdue. And I think the fact that we've allowed Iran to have a stranglehold on the global economy by dictating the terms of the Strait of Hormuz was unacceptable, which makes it very difficult, I think, for some people to grasp right now that this isn't about gas prices. This is about national security and the global economy. This has more to do with resetting expectations around how do we interact with other global economy participants and whether or not we're going to let Iran dictate the terms of that. Right now, you've got China in Southeast Asia really bearing the consequence of the Strait of Hormuz closing, as well as Europe. And so when you start looking at our NATO partners that are apprehensive about assisting us, you really have to ask them, okay, what is the function of our alliance if you see that we've been absorbing the brunt of securing and ensuring passage through the Strait of Hormuz for decades? We've been providing the safety and freedom of navigation that you've taken for granted, that have allowed you to invest in your countries. Now that we're addressing the source of that threat and what we've had to absorb over the last several decades, you're unwilling to support us because you've either lacked the ability to project power or you've lacked the investment in your own defense that you can't support our interests in making things better for you. So my concern is that we need to focus on military objectives. We need to continue down the path that we're on and finish the job. And that is to not only degrade the IRGC completely, but to then set the conditions for a transition of power internally without a single boot on the ground that allows the Iranians to decide how they want to govern themselves outside of the theocracy that has dominated the last 47 years in Iran. Now, what will that look like? Well, first and foremost, we have to open the Strait of Hormuz, and that has to be a coalition. That has to be a coalition of countries that have benefited and will continue to benefit from the nearly 20% of world oil that flows through there and the nearly 30% of liquid natural gas. Those countries need to take on the role and responsibility of ensuring safe passage of their ships. Or if we're going to do that, then we've got to figure out how that the system is going to better align to our interests globally and not have our forces and our interests constantly under threat by Iran. So my hope is that we finally resolve this, that we're able to achieve our military objectives completely, and then that will set the conditions for a diplomatic solution, whether that's a regional solution or an internal solution in Iran. But I don't want to see an escalation beyond what we're doing right now, which is an extremely effective air campaign, and then securing the safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, either unilaterally or with a coalition of countries that ultimately benefit from the products that move through there.
One of the interesting things that I find when people bring up kind of the NATO alliance concept is, you with the European Union and their kind of progressive values since really the European Union came into existence, there's been pretty much active chaos going on in the Middle East, which has created a profound immigration reality, whether you call it a fiasco or a positive, to most European countries. When you look at demographics in Sweden, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, they have monster populations of people that have come from these affected regions where we've done either regime change or we've integrated in whatever types of assistance, whether it was in Libya with the removal of Gaddafi or Iraq. Obviously, I don't know where your feelings on are that, but we certainly know that regime change didn't go as we thought it would go. You can see, in my mind, it makes sense because they have these monster populations, right? That they go then and start re-engaging in whatever militaristic activities in those straits or even around the straits or whatever it might be. So to me, it makes sense, a lot more sense than the desire to want to get into it with Russia and Ukraine. That didn't make any sense to me at all. But I do understand the necessity for fuel consumption, oil, as well as fertilizers. That's a big problem, right? A lot of fertilizer components pass through there. But what I did like is that you said you didn't want any boots on the ground. What do you think is it feasible with the continued strategic targeted strikes of IRGC officials, people within the branch of the Ayatollah structure? Is it feasible that we're actually going to get to somebody that we can negotiate that has, I don't want to say control of the population, but has a number of people, a level of influence where they can quell the growing animosity towards Israel and the United States? Obviously, you know this, right? When we went into Iraq and we started really annihilating the power infrastructure, we created the insurgency, right? And as well as other places, we allowed, the flood of Iranian proxies into eastern Iraq. So, the challenge I have is you have a very complicated situation as it is. How do we know who to negotiate with, and what are the circumstances that can generate, an actual forum of diplomacy? I read this morning that Iran or China and Russia are now getting more involved, and they're trying to broker some Pakistani accords. Tell me what that looks like in your mind. How does that brokering a peace look? What does that look like to you?
So I'll start with the first question, which was, can we, to use a crude term, can we kill our way out of this? The answer is no. You can't at some point. But I do think we can whittle down the leadership structure to the point where we've essentially broken the will of the regime. And that's what we need to do. And what you're going to have is the Iranian people have been living under this oppressive regime for decades. The Iranian people want a better solution than what they have. The question is how do we identify the core group of folks that are vested in the regime? In other words, without the regime, they don't exist. There's an existential threat. And that's really it's not a single answer. I do think that we cut off the head in a way that has now created some chaos. Their economy is failing. There's a tremendous amount of pressure amongst your average Iranian families and population. Those individuals at some point are going to put pressure on folks that would either be a part of the military or part of the organization that was there to maintain some level of social order. As that breaks down, as the military rank structure breaks down, people either quit, they walk away, or they start fighting their own insurgency. That remains to be seen. But I do think that we've done a sufficient job so far of identifying leadership, eliminating the leadership. We're now responding to what I think is a pre-planned, decentralized response. And that's why it seems chaotic, and that's why it's not really achieving anything other than trying to foster chaos throughout the region. But eventually what should happen, whether we hit energy infrastructure or other infrastructure that's in support of the war effort, it will put more and more pressure on the regime. And if that regime cannot sustain the pressure that's coming from us, coming from the region and its own population, at some point it will collapse. The problem that we had in Iraq, and I spent a lot of time there, as I'm sure you had as well, was the nation building in the hearts and minds. That was our biggest mistake, was getting beyond military objectives and now getting into the realm of force diplomacy. We need to go in, focus on our military objectives, undermine the ability of this regime to project power or to effectuate any damage in the region, undermine its ability to control its own population, and then allow for the diplomatic process to unfold, which may involve us directly and it may not. It could involve regional partners, or it could be other global partners that will broker a deal, that will identify the right people to set for the conditions for a transition to a regime that will be at least neutral, if not friendly to the West. And what I mean by neutral is the Strait of Hormuz is an international strait. We cannot tolerate Iran running roughshod over that region. And the global economy has an interest in the Straits of Hormuz being opened by any regime. My hope is that we've diminished the IRGC sufficiently enough to take the theocracy that's in place and eliminate it from any relevant influence, and then allow for whatever the next regime is going to be to occur without involving U.S. forces on the ground and without any nation building or policing operations by U.S. military.
It's a good answer. You know, I never spent any time I was in Afghanistan my whole time with the SEAL teams, Blackwater, and the Central Intelligence Agency. But, you know, definitely had a lot of friends that spent a lot of time, lost a lot of friends over there as well, too. You know, I really hope that our strategic partners kind of put pressure, not so much, you know, I understand why they don't want to jump in militaristically, but, you know, if they can help broker this deal, I think that would benefit the entire world for sure. Because you're right, there is a choke point, and they're definitely exposing that vulnerability at the highest. All right, to go back to the final thing, and one that I'm sure is really dear to your heart, is the national immigration issue. I talked a little bit about the immigration challenges that the European Union are seeing. You back up, and one of you know, Trump's, you know, centerpieces of his entire campaign is shutting down the southern border, which he has done, but then to go out and get rid of all the violent criminals that have flooded in, and whatever those numbers, whatever you want to believe, as low as 11 million, as high as 30 million, somewhere in there, we don't know, because of just how open the border was. What's going to be your position on immigration moving forward? Obviously, there's a lot of independents, and I think some more, I don't know if there is such thing as a progressive conservative, but, you know, there were a lot of younger conservatives who did not like what transpired in Minnesota, did not like kind of the masked tactical guys on the streets wrapping people up or pulling workers off a rooftop or however it's being portrayed out there. I'd love to get your thoughts on immigration, and what you how you hope to impact it when you get to DC.
Well, I start with we're a nation of laws, and so the rule of law has to be first and foremost. What we saw under the Biden administration was the big breakdown of the rule of law. When you had them saying that we need additional authority, we need to pass more laws, well, that was the complete wrong answer. Enforce existing laws. If you don't like existing laws, change them. But this idea that we can cherry pick which laws we're going to enforce or what we're going to ignore or what's going to be deemed too hard is unacceptable. The fact that we have states and counties that declare themselves sanctuary areas is unacceptable. You know, we live in a country of laws, and we start with accountability and personal responsibility. What Trump did was the necessary first step, which is you had to secure the border. You had to stop the flow of illegal immigration. Now that you've done that, you can now look at how do you determine where the real problem is. And that could be solved with the Dignity Act, which is comprehensive immigration reform, which I support. And it looks at saying anybody who came in the last 5 years has to go. If you came in as a part of that flood, then you have to go because you've cut in line. It's unlawful, it's unfair, and there's no way to reconcile that in a nation of laws. Then there's at least provisions in the Dignity Act that says if you've been a long-standing resident, perhaps in an illegal status, but you have not accepted any state assistance, you have not committed any crimes, and you've otherwise been a contributing member, well, at least then you can get in line for the possibility of legal status. That creates a pathway to legal status. If you're able to endure the 7 years of transitioning from illegal to legal status while paying a fine and continuing to not provide and not receive any state assistance, then you've at least made up the gap of everybody else you jumped in front of. Then after those 7 years, you can get in line to become a U.S. citizen. That at least addresses what is a longstanding existence here, whether it was somebody who came here as a child and is now finds themselves in an illegal status but otherwise contributing, and somebody who has not had to been a burden, quite frankly. But I think we have to start looking at the ability to assimilate to the rule of law. What makes this country so great is that freedom is responsibility, and that responsibility is to adhere to the rules and understanding the regulations that allow us to prosper as individuals and as communities. And when that breaks down, as it has, whether it's because of the influx of illegal immigration or the inability to enforce federal law, well, now the very essence of our system is been compromised. So you have to restore accountability, you have to foster personal responsibility, and you have to then address this through comprehensive immigration reform, which I believe now can occur because we've secured the border and we've demonstrated that we didn't need more money. We didn't necessarily need more laws. We simply needed to enforce what was there in place. In CD6, you probably have come across that up in Washington County, they put in an ICE facility that would be a transfer facility. This would hold individuals from anywhere from 1 to 3 days as they're being adjudicated in this process. These are going to be individuals that arguably already have deportation orders or in an illegal status and have to be held in custody. My two opponents, Trone and Delaney, have come out in opposition to this, despite the fact that nearly 80% of Washington County residents support it. They support it from a rule of law perspective. They support it from an economic development standpoint. And then the last part of it is they see it as an opportunity to participate in this process of addressing an immigration crisis. And the fact that you have Trone and Delaney, out-of-district multimillionaires, now playing national politics once again at the expense of local residents, contractors that would benefit from upgrading the facility, local residents that would work at the facility, and then assisting the overall interest in providing some level of stability in a broken immigration system, just goes to show how out of touch they are and how and where they put the residents of CD6, which is at the back end of their interest in national politics at the forefront. So the short answer is I support the rule of law. I start with accountability and transparency. And most importantly, I would support comprehensive immigration reform, whether it's the Dignity Act in its current form or a version of it. I would certainly support, because we've seen that inaction has led us to where we are, which is a broken system that's been flooded with illegal immigrants and a lack of enforcement.
Well, and a profound amount of corruption, right? All you got to do is follow young Nick Shirley, and you can realize just the magnitude of funds that are just bleeding out in every city, every state, across the country right now. It's an abomination. Well, Chris, I think your answers and your descriptions of what you're running on are incredibly eloquent. They're well thought out. Obviously, your career as a JAG officer in the military has prepared you, hopefully, for what you're about the next battlefield of what you're getting into. I just can't thank you enough for coming on the show. Where can people follow you, support you, and what do you got? What's big coming next down the pipeline?
Well, I really appreciate that. One thing I would add is, in the Marine Corps, we're not JAGs. You're just a line officer with a law degree.
That's right. So
I was a company commander in Iraq. I was a MU XO whenever our XO had to go ashore. So, part of the draw of the Marine Corps for lawyers is that you're a line officer first. You're expected to serve as a leader. And then where I found myself more often than not, if I wasn't outside of the wire with Marines, was within the 3 shop as a planner.
Yeah,
in that
awesome.
I wasn't a special advisor to the commander. I brought a legal perspective to a planning priority that was about setting conditions for Marines to get outside of the wire and come back as best they possibly can, minimizing risk and then focusing on mission accomplishment. But I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the website. BURNETTForCongress.com is where anybody could go to sign up for our newsletter. They could sign up to volunteer, and then also they could sign up to donate. We're running a grassroots campaign. Part of the reason why I'm running was so that families like mine and other families in CD6 that are struggling can have a voice. So every penny we raise, we're going to spend on voter engagement. This is not going to be a fancy campaign. This is not going to have a lot of polished TV ads. This is going to be yard signs in town hall meetings, talking about the issues, trying to bring a conservative Republican voice back to Congressional District 6. So you can go onto the website and donate, and I promise you, every penny that you trust me with, I will spend as wisely as possible to make CD6 a Republican stronghold again.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, sir. Good luck, and God bless you.
Thank you.